I was asked to come and talk to you about the chemicals and pesticides rules in the EU. I've actually also switched my title of my talk a little bit, so I hope I can beg your indulgence. What I'd like to talk about is the policies and the laws that guide endocrine disrupting chemicals in the EU, whether they're agricultural chemicals or industrial chemicals. And I'd like to talk to you about something called the cocktail effect, which is the effect of chemicals together in our bodies, in our environment. So, first, very briefly, for those of you that don't know the Health and Environment Alliance, we're a non-profit, we're in the public interest, and we're located in Brussels. Whoops. And we are a network of other organizations. So the Health Defense Organization here in Spain is one of our members. And we have other member organizations in different countries, both in the EU and outside the EU, but within the WHO European region. We have also public health insurers, we have patient groups, we have scientists, we have women's groups. We have what I'd call a very good genetic diversity of member organizations. And the role of our organization is, in general, amongst the public and also amongst various stakeholders, to raise awareness of how environmental protection can improve public health. And we specifically work to strengthen EU and WHO policies on environment that will improve public health. We want to better represent our members in Brussels and better explain Brussels to our members and to the wider public. So I would like to just go through a little bit of the history of what's called the strategy for endocrine disruptors in the EU. It arose from about the mid-1990s, when evidence of impacts on wildlife were beginning to raise alarm bells amongst scientists, and the links with human diseases were being posited, chronic diseases which were seemingly rising in a number of countries. So one of the books that was... maybe that's better. Okay. One of the books that was very well known in popularizing the issue of endocrine disruptors was Our Stolen Future. I don't know if many of you were reading the Spanish version or are familiar with this book. As a result of the attention that was starting to be paid on endocrine disruptors, the EU had a workshop on this issue in 1996 and decided that what the EU really needed was an integrated strategy for assessment and for monitoring of endocrine disrupting chemicals, and also that the EU should be considering taking precautionary measures to act to reduce endocrine disruptors. The European Parliament gave a resolution, and out of this came a document from the European Commission, which is called the European Community Strategy on, I'll give you the full title in a minute. So that's the timeline. 1990, just at the end of 1999, we had an agreed EU strategy on endocrine disruptors. Some of the key elements of this strategy are that we need further research and particular kinds of research, that we need better cooperation at various different levels in the OECD in particular, that there needed to be better communication to the public, and that there was a need for policy action. Oh, and I have the name of the actual strategy there. So specifically when it comes to policy action, there were a number of different laws that were mentioned, and the idea was to look at these laws and to see if they needed to be revised and adapted. As a result, since the time that the endocrine disrupting strategy was started, we've had a revision of the regulation that deals with so-called industrial chemicals. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, I want to emphasize we call it industrial chemicals, but that doesn't mean it just belongs in factories out there somewhere. It means it ends up in the dyes of the clothes that you wear, in the plastics that surround you in daily life, in a wide variety of daily consumer products. There was also a revision of the Pesticides Regulation, the agricultural chemicals, and then the non-agricultural pesticides, the Biocides Regulation. Other regulations that are potentially within the revision vizier of the Commission are drinking water and water environmental quality standards. And in fact, the water quality standards, the environmental quality standards are going through revision right now. So that's again the timeline of the revisions that we've had. Very specifically, I want to just talk about the Pesticides Regulation for a minute. And this is usually not what I do, because I actually work mostly on REACH and not on the Pesticides Regulation. But the reason I want to emphasize the Pesticides Regulation is because the most recent revision brought in a ban on endocrine disrupting chemicals. There will be no authorization for pesticides which may cause negative effects in humans. There is the potential for some exceptions to that rule. I won't go into that. I will just say that this is historically a big step in the development of EU legislation, that they've taken a whole category of chemicals and said, if these may cause harm to humans, they will not allow to be used for pesticides. The question is, how do we know what is an endocrine disrupting pesticide? Because unlike other harmful chemicals in the EU, we don't yet have an official classification or categorization system. The EU has to propose criteria for how these endocrine disruptors will be identified and assessed, and they have to propose these by the end of next year. And in fact, under the biocides legislation, we went even a step further, which is the EU Commission has to adopt these criteria by the exact same date as they have to propose them for the pesticides legislation. So in the very near future, we will have a list of identifying features or ways in which you can define the identifying features of what an endocrine disruptor is. In the meantime, there are interim criteria if authorization decisions for particular pesticides needs to be taken. And the other thing that we have is that when these criteria are final, the European Commission has the stated intention of allowing these criteria to fit and be applied to other legislation. Now, exactly how they get taken up in the legal formulation is another question, but what that means is one of the ideas guiding their formulation of the criteria is that it will not just be for the pesticides law or for the biocides law. It should apply to other laws, including REACH, food contact materials, medical devices, and a series of other laws. What this has thrown up, of course, is that the fight is basically being taken now. I say the fight because we have a number of vested interests that are very concerned with any reduction in the amount of pesticides that are on the market into another whole arena, which is the scientific formulation of the criteria to define endocrine disruptors. And I won't go into too much detail. I just want to tantalize you with these two pictures, which are intended to illustrate some of what's happening around the debate there. The monkey that doesn't want to listen refers back to what Claire brought out very well in her presentation about not taking up the innovative academic science that are not in GLP and OECD studies. And the wolf in sheep's clothing refers to a kind of a funnel effect of taking a particular criteria and giving it a more advantageous position than others, so that later on certain other criteria couldn't apply because certain substances have already fallen out of the selection. And we do actually have a paper on it that we did together with an organization called ChemTrust. We have that. I don't believe it's actually here, but we have it on our website, and I can send paper copies to anybody who wishes afterwards. Okay, so we have had the various initial statements of recognition in the EU that we need to deal with endocrine disruptors. We've had revisions of the laws, and now we're here in 2012. We had last year a progress report on how far we've come in this endocrine disrupting strategy, and the question is, will the EU revise its strategy? All the indications are that they will, and so what I want to encourage you is to participate in the debate of what sort of vision the EU needs to have for a revised strategy. What do we need in terms of research needs? What do we need in terms of human and environmental monitoring? What should we be asking for in terms of getting exposure reductions? The first strategy gave some very open-ended goals. And as a public interest organisation, HEAL believes that ultimately we need to come to certain kinds of targets and deadlines. Most of these are usually in specific legislation, but we believe it's also time to start putting these into an EU strategy. And there are a series of other issues. So I want to encourage you to participate in the debates, either in contact with our organisation or in contact with the European Union representatives directly, the Commission, the Members of Parliament, the Council. I'm now going to switch very quickly to the cocktail effect in EU policy. And just summarise the situation, which is that at the moment, although we have scientific indications that when you put individual chemicals together, you get a bigger effect than what you have with just the 1 + 1 + 1 of those chemicals, we don't have any form of integrated risk assessment in the EU that really deals with different exposures from different chemicals in different products via different routes that end up together in the human body or in the environment. There is, in the pesticides law, the requirement that the cumulative impacts of residues in food and feed get evaluated, but this was put in 7 years ago, and during this entire time the European Food Safety Authority has actually been discussing how are they going to go about this. They've now come up with a particular proposal which we don't really feel is going to do very well on protecting public health, but I won't go into details. The Pesticides law also has a formulation of an obligation that if you have the same active product the same active substance in different products, there needs to be a cumulative effect assessment of that, which is a step forward. But again, depending on exactly how that plays out with the kinds of scientific approaches used, we could get into problems, and that is for the same active substance. If a particular biocidal active substance has an additive effect with an industrial chemical that's under REACH, we don't have any way to unify those and make sure that the risk assessment takes both into account. And then finally in REACH, we don't have a clear methodology for how REACH chemicals and non-REACH chemicals get risk assessed for their total impact. What we do have is at least the initial attempt in one pillar of REACH, which is the restrictions or the bans procedure, that you can propose to have multiple chemicals that find their way into the same product or products get risk assessed and banned together. But again, that's the same product. It doesn't deal with the non-REACH and the REACH together or multiple different products. However, this is a new proposal. It still hasn't been fully run through the entire decision-making procedure yet. We're still looking to see how that will come up. And my question is, for you and for us all together, is what do we want our environment ministers to say? The next time the environment ministers will be talking about this is in June, and it will be under the hat of a document on the 7th Environmental Action Programme, which is a particular document about how the EU should deal with environmental issues. And the ministers are going to be discussing this in June. They have already said a few things about nano mixtures and endocrine disrupting chemicals. And this is essentially a chance whereby we can express to our ministers that we want them to take this extremely seriously, and we want them to advance the way the EU deals with the cocktail effect. This, very briefly, is a slide that's too full, but it's the timeline on chemicals mixtures. If you download the PowerPoint later, afterwards you will have it all there and can read it at your leisure. Essentially, the main point is what I have just said, which is that the Environment Council in June has the opportunity to talk about how the EU addresses mixtures, and we think that it's very important for you to express to your elected representatives and to the people you advise that this needs to be taken on in a good way. And I would just also emphasize that because we are still in May, there is a Commission communication that is due to come out on how it wishes to tackle mixtures. I'm not actually expecting very ambitious or visionary things from there, but it would be possibly by the end of next week. So the opportunities to improve our public health protection. As I've said, specifically the June meeting of the European Environment Ministers, and there you can make expressions not only about the mixtures, the cocktail effect, but also about endocrine disruptors. There are always your members of the European Parliament who don't hear enough from their constituents, as far as I'm concerned. And specifically in the European Parliament, what's very exciting is that they will be doing a voluntary report on endocrine disruptors in the autumn. They've decided to take up this topic to contribute their views and the views of their constituents to the European Commission on what needs to be in an EU strategy. And now and ongoing until September and beyond, until that report is finalised, is the time to contact your members of Parliament. And there are some members of Parliament who are more involved than others, and I can inform you about who those are bilaterally. And then there's also your government officials as well. The EU has an expert group who are discussing how endocrine disruptors should be identified. They are formulating advice for the EU. They're going to be writing a report. And specifically for the Spanish people here in this hall, I'd like to express my concern that at the last 3 meetings, the Spanish representative was not able to attend. We do think it's important that every EU member state has their representatives at this meeting and are active in expressing their views and their expertise in how to identify endocrine disrupting chemicals. And finally, the other thing is to keep in touch with the Health and Environment Alliance, because we conduct a number of different projects, including advocacy to all these various different EU institutions at various points. We also try to do a lot of awareness raising and explain the changes in the science and emerging concepts to the public and to other stakeholders. You will see at the back of the hall some reports we did on breast cancer, where we pick up the science from people like Nicolas Alea, Vivian Howard, and a number of other scientists around the room. And most recently, we did a report, we did a leaflet about a report which was co-written by Miguel Porta on diabetes and obesity. So we have a whole slew of different things that we do. And if you're interested in helping advance the EU policy, we would very much like to hear from you and ways that we can collaborate together. Thank you.